author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Hello and welcome to Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's special edition, we are talking politics and faux progressivism. It's going to be quite the show. Please remember, Liberty Nation Radio is sponsored by LibertyNation.com. You can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. And you're on Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides, and we're very fortunate to have with us Liberty Nation senior political analyst and longtime host of this here radio show, Mr. Tim Donner. Thanks for coming back in, Tim.
Hello, Mark. Good to be here, as always.
So I couldn't resist getting you in because you've highlighted something in a recent article on LibertyNation.com that is so encapsulating of the mood of the nation that you read it and it's almost... You have to, whether you approve of what Donald Trump is doing or not, you almost have to, you're forcibly admitted to, you're forced to admit that here's the point and here's the important point. And this piece, it was called Tracking 47. It's really about how approval polls don't really mean as much as right direction, wrong track polls, because that gives the mood of the nation. Would you like to sort of expand on what you found, what the theme was?
Well, I think the point of the article, more than anything else, was to say that, presidential popularity or presidential approval tends to be a combination of personal popularity and job performance. And it comes and goes as tariffs are added, subtracted, added back, as peace talks between Ukraine and Russia, or between the U.S. and Gaza, the U.S. and Iran, they wax and they wane. And so the personal popularity polls are even job performance polls have a very limited usage, especially since, we have a president who has so many, balls in the air, so to speak, very few of which have yet to land on solid ground. So there's so much up in the air. And you can talk about inflation, you can talk about foreign policy, you talk about the economy, you can talk about the border. And generally his favorability is very high on these things, relatively speaking. But the way to really gauge how people feel about life under the 47th president, the best indicator of that is the right track, wrong track numbers, which get reported but are often understated in terms of their importance, because it shows beyond just the popularity of a given politician. We have to remember that there are millions upon millions, untold millions of Americans who don't care about politics, who don't like politics, who don't follow politics, and are pretty much agnostic or think both parties are corrupt, or they just don't pay attention for any reason. But those people have an opinion about what life is like.
Yeah.
And now that we're 6 months past the election and more than 4 months past when Trump took the oath of office, seemed a good time to take stock. And what the right track, wrong track numbers show is that the right track right now is at its highest level since 2009. That's 16 years. And that one in 2009 was when Barack Obama had just taken office, and hope and change were the themes of the country. And so everybody sort of felt on an upward swing, other than conservative.
I should point something out here. So it's beginning of 2009 when it was at the same point that it is now. But that was the last high point. So everybody had in their hearts hope and change, or many people had in their hearts hope and change, and then were clearly sorely disappointed. Otherwise, that number would have stayed the same or gone up, right?
Yes, no, that's true. And it only went down from there, especially during his second term. But An important caveat in the right track, wrong track numbers is to understand that the wrong track has always outweighed the right track for the entirety of the century. Because I think, for example, today, some Democratic voters who voted for Harris might still believe that their lives are better under Trump than they were before, or at least better than they expected it to be. But they're not going to tell. They're not going to tell a pollster, "Oh yeah, I think we're on the right track." So you're almost guaranteed to have 50% of people who say we're on the wrong track, for starters.
Yeah.
But all of that said, the difference between now and the election of 2024 and the day that Trump took office is stark. During the last 10 polls, right track, wrong track polls taken by various organizations of 2024, range from right track as low as 17% to a high of 34% to a 27% average. So you take that 27% when Biden was still in office and Kamala Harris was the candidate for president, and you compare it to now, Americans are on the whole 63% more believing we're on the right track than they were before the election. And the difference is almost as stark since January 20th. So on any given issue, let's say people are still very anxious about the tariffs because it's a high risk, high reward strategy that's far from having landed where it's going to eventually wind up. And whether Trump says he can end the Russia-Ukraine war and then he can't, or what you feel about the economy or the tax cut bills or the DOGE program, those are just components. But the composite of all of those things can be discovered most perfectly, not perfectly, but most perfectly with the right track, wrong track numbers. And those numbers reveal that Americans, maybe you might say they're relieved compared to where they were before the election in the last couple of years. But they're also more happy with the trajectory of their lives than any time since the early hope and change days of Barack Obama. And I think that speaks volumes about the fact that whether you agree with him on any individual decision or not, the highest number of people in 16 years believe we're on the right track in this country.
I wonder, once, as you mentioned, these juggling balls that have yet to hit the ground, I wonder if any of them land positively, then that there might be a near record, well, certainly beating 2009. Because if we're at 2009 numbers now, which was the previous high point for this century, I wonder if any of these land correctly or in the right spots, that we might see that increase. Now, we're going to be back with Tim Donner after this short break. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And you're back on Liberty Nation Radio. I remain your host, Mark Angelides, and we're continuing our conversation with longtime host of this here radio show, Tim Donner. Now, Tim, thanks for sticking around. You're during the break, we were discussing political analysis and the purpose, the ways, the means, and the weirding magic of it, and how it tends to go. But I think that this is quite an important topic to cover, because a couple of data points on this. Jen Psaki, former White House press secretary. Let's get her chronological resume in order. Former left-leaning CNN pundit, White House press secretary to left-leaning pundit on MSNBC. They're the same job, right? They're the same job to bolster the
essentially,
Party.
Yes.
But she, in her new slot, I think it's being reported that 47% drop in viewership. And you told me earlier about, we were talking earlier about Jake Tapper, now that he's decided to do a tell-all book trying to find the culprits of who was covering up for Joe Biden. And if I may just give Mr. Tapper some advice, walk into your bathroom, turn the light on, look in the mirror, and you'll find out the people who were covering for Joe Biden. But you mentioned that he'd always annoyed the political right because he was such a fanboy of Democrats no matter what. And now he's also gone and annoyed the political left because he's exposed them all as corrupt and willing to have somebody who is clearly cognitively impaired in the White House as long as they retain power. Tim, what's happened to political analysis in this country?
Well, the reason that political analysis is so interesting writ large is because politics, what makes politics fascinating is that it's a study of human behavior. It's a study of human behavior under pressure and how people respond to pressure, which is not something you necessarily see in your everyday life. But if you are the leader of the free world, you're always under pressure to make decisions about things. And how you make those decisions is maybe even less fascinating than why you made decisions. And that's the point of political analysts like myself, to get down to the motives behind what somebody's doing. Now, if J.D. Vance is asked, do you approve of the Trump presidency? He's going to say yes. And
we learn nothing from it, right?
We learn nothing from
that. We know that answer.
But I think, for example, with political behavior now and trying to analyze where the Democrats in particular are headed, which seems to be into the ditch, but they haven't gotten themselves out of it yet. It's interesting, for example, that one relatively obscure senator from Arizona, Ruben Gallego, is now speaking like a Bill Clinton Democrat. Why is he doing it? Well, you look at the motivation, you can say he knows his party has to get back to something other than insane progressive policies, which got them kicked out of office to begin with. He understands that they need to get back to the center, or at least to present being in the center. But he also has personal ambition involved in it. So there's many layers of causation, shall we say, in politics. And getting to the heart of it, getting to the heart of political behavior is a fascinating field, one I've sort of engaged in informally and formally over many years.
So I think there's something happening with analysis right now, and it's fascinating. It's from an anthropological. I feel like Jane Goodall sometimes watching what's happening, because we used to have people who could, take information and they could, bypass their own, dispassionately
analyze. And there's a few people still like that.
They're rarer than they used to be.
It's true. One guy that's good at that is Mark Halprin.
Yeah,
he's pretty much straight down the middle. And Brit Hume will call a spade too. He will say Trump had a terrible debate. Now, part of that is because he's at an advanced, enough of an advanced age that he doesn't really care what people think.
He's not looking for his next job.
He's not looking for his next job. So it can be particularly honest. But I mean, for example, as an analyst, I may or may not like Joe Biden, but I can look and see that the biggest mistake he ever made was not to pull out of running for re-election, or simply not run for re-election at all after the 2022 midterms, where he would have been considered a heroic figure because he beat Trump and he led the Democrats to a better than expected performance in the 2022 midterms. But I can also then say later on, when he didn't do it, that was the biggest mistake of his career. Right. So that is, and it's a good position for an analyst, Mark, because it means I'm not supposed to take sides. I'm supposed to analyze why things happen for better or for worse, whether someone's on the left or the right.
There's something very freeing about treating your examination of something through an analytical lens, because sure, we all, in our hearts, we're all polemicists, right? We're all polemicist
Yes.
poets in our hearts. And we, if we're with friends having dinner and politics comes up and they're like-minded friends, or even if they're not, we can wax lyrical about the state of politics and the particular foibles of various politicians or policies. But when you're looking at something through an analytical lens, it frees you up. It's what's the right way to say this? It's an unshackling of what you're doing and allows you to just go straight for the key points. And somebody who I think was superb at that, I'm sure you'd agree, was George Orwell in his essays. And
Yes.
so one of our editors, we had this conversation with him this morning. Funnily enough, he said, as a fiction author, George Orwell, so as an essayist, just unbelievable. And I'm inclined to agree with that, because he never took a position that was so extreme that he couldn't just go straight to the center again and say, this is why I might be right, this is why I might be wrong, but here's what you should be looking at.
Right. So you're saying, as an analyst, don't look at what happened. You presumably already know what happened because
Ideally, yeah.
because you're analyzing things
Yeah.
that are in the news, that are breaking, that are headlines, that sort of thing. An analyst's job is to break it down into its component parts as to why it happened, what it represents, what it might mean going forward. Right.
Isn't this why podcasts are becoming so much more popular than news shows?
Yes, because they drill deeper into subjects that are of interest to that particular podcast viewer or listener. I mean, there's podcasts for everything these days. Yeah. There's a podcast just for people who are interested in how to clean their pots and pans.
I've seen loads of those as a pan enthusiast.
Yes,
I've seen a lot.
Yes, I know you've liked and subscribed to several channels like that. But the point is that, this is what people demand these days, is to know a little bit deeper than what they're reading in the headlines. And that's a good thing, because too many Americans, especially those disinterested in politics and current affairs, tend to read the headline and maybe the first sentence of stories and get a skewed view of what's really going on.
Yeah, very true. The podcast I keep thinking about now, I've been a long time watcher of Mr. Joe Rogan, and when he had Donald Trump on right before the election, what I loved about it was not a question like a Q&A session. What's your position on this? What are you going to do about this? It was so wide ranging that we even discovered that Donald Trump, if he had the chance, would become a whale psychologist. You are not going to get that in the is it the John Brady briefing room? You're not going to get that kind of analysis. Tim Donner, I appreciate your analysis. Listeners, please go check out his writing over at libertynation.com. Thanks ever so much for being here, Tim.
My pleasure, Mark.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And you're back on Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio American Network. I remain your host, Mark Angelides. We're very fortunate to have with us today actor, filmmaker, author, journalist, political commentator, a Renaissance man for the ages, Mr. Yuval David. Thanks for joining us, Yuval.
Well, to be a Renaissance man, recognized by a Renaissance man, is delightful. If only I had the curls on top of my head as you do, I would definitely be much more successful. But I do have curls in my mind. My mind is twisted by the insanity that we're seeing across society. So I wish that the curls were only in my hair and not in my thought process.
Well, one can be fixed and the other can't, unfortunately. So let's talk about those particular detriments that we're witnessing recently. Now, you and I got brought together initially over the shooting that happened in Washington, D.C. this month. A tragic situation that for some reason appears to have, at the time of recording, largely disappeared from the headlines. Now, you were in Washington, D.C. when that happened. Could you give us your take on the feelings that came out then and the initial aftermath?
Well, the feelings that came out were horrendous and still are horrendous feelings that can be defined as shocked but not surprised.
Mm,
We've been listening to the language of these horrible groups chanting out in their riots, in their protests, in their demonstrations, violent, hateful speech that calls for intifada, that calls for jihad, that masks the calls for violence with rhyming couplets and
mm.
placard strategy that might sound like a nursery rhyme, but that what's beneath it are calls for violence. So, how surprised can we really be when horrendous terrorist attacks happen here in the United States? We're seeing these terrorist attacks happening across the world by people who are telling us what they're going to do, and then they do it. The
Mm.
problem is security. The problem is safety for all of us. And the other problem is we're not condemning these hate groups for what they are.
That's a very important point you raise, I think, about they're telling us what they're going to do, and we see this in my country, in Britain, we've seen the marches nominally supporting Gaza, many people openly supporting Hamas, and they're chanting the Free Palestine, same as the killer did in Washington, D.C. And it seems to me that the legacy media, they seem to have this idea that when they're chanting Intifada or from the river to the sea, they're giving them the most generous interpretation of what they mean by those phrases. And it's an interpretation that wouldn't be afforded to any other group. And that strikes me as strange, that you have these people who say they're marching for something, but the something is very clearly a direct call for violence against the Jewish community. And so why do you think it gets downplayed so much? Because these terror attacks, as you say, and it was a terror attack. So what you find is that you've got this whole large movement, and then it's pushing the idea of intifada and violence, and they seem surprised when it happens.
Well, this is one of the things that the Islamicization
Mm,
of the West has done so strategically and so brilliantly in terms of taking violent movements, focusing on the rhetoric and using the rhetoric to manipulate people who might not otherwise be violent until they can possibly become
mm,
violent themselves. The Islamist movements understood that they cannot only present the violence of the Islamist intifada, jihad, terror agendas of bullying tactics to murder anybody who's not just like them, which includes Jews, Christians, Israelis, Druze, Baha'i, Buddhists, Hindus, secular Muslims. All of those people are infidels according to them and deserve to die. So within their own countries and within the regions that they dominate and control, they're able to openly engage in violence and slaughter people. Now, when they focus on the West, they're not able to present the violence as a way to manipulate all of these peoples. So they use the language, they use the placard strategy, they use these nursery rhymes that if they rhyme, they must be true. And for the useful idiots across the UK, across the United States, across Canada, across all of these countries in Europe that we're seeing, there are people on the far left who are being manipulated by these nursery rhymes because they're presented in the most simplistic ways. And
yeah.
that's what they're doing.
It's very much it's that from the Saul Alinsky Rule for Radicals playbook, in terms of creating a simple message, repeating it often, and trying to create that earworm situation. So it's In fact, and this is a slight aside, it reminds me of I think it was Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury, where he said all you need to do is give them a slogan that they can chant and they don't have to think for themselves. And this sloganeering here, it comes with a whole host of baggage behind it, and yet they can be presented at a very, very surface level. And this is really a thin veneer of it's about justice, it's about fairness for people who are oppressed, and it's all. It seems to me it's all part of a larger. And I don't want to target all socialists with this, but of a larger socialist push towards destruction of cultural values, things that have essentially made the Western world the success that it is. And they want to drag that back. And as you rightly point out, Islamists are climbing on the back of the socialist movements. And in some ways, I think the socialist movement's climbing on the back of Islamism too.
Oh, absolutely. Because
Try and
they
use
see,
each other for a seed of destruction.
well, it's some people call it the red-green alliance to describe the alliance between far-left activists and Islamist movements. It's one of the strangest and most dangerous coalitions in modern history, where we see leftists who believe in gender equality, LGBT rights, secularism, free speech, civil liberties, and Islamists who believe in Sharia law, gender segregation, religious supremacy, and death to apostates and gays. The only thing that they seem to agree upon is this virulent hatred of Israel and, by extension, Jews, this virulent hatred of anybody who is deemed successful, right? So we've seen all of these old, ancient anti-Semitic tropes rise up where they're condemning Jews because they think Jews are successful. Well, throughout history, for 1,000 years more, Jews were condemned because they were different. Jews were condemned because they weren't Christian. Jews were condemned because they weren't Muslim. Jews were condemned and criticized for being capitalist. Jews were condemned and criticized for being socialist and for being communist. Jews were condemned for being separate than society. And then Jews were criticized for being part of society. Jews keep being blamed again and again and again anytime there are social ills that are rising up and bubbling up to the surface. So within this red-green alliance, they're focusing on Jews in this overly simplistic oppressor versus oppressed narrative. And we're hearing more and more people speaking about it as we recognize the hypocrisy and the idiocy that is prevailing throughout the progressive movement, capital P progressive, because I'm a lowercase p progressive. I do believe in progress, but the progressive movement has gone awry.
Let's continue talking about that after this short break. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And you're back on Liberty Nation Radio on the Radio America Network. I remain your host, Mark Angelides, and we're continuing our conversation with filmmaker, actor, journalist Yuval David. Now, Yuval, you mentioned at the end of the last segment about how we talked about progressivism and you identified yourself as a small p progressive, which I think is an interesting distinction. But I want to delve into what's happening across American society in terms of how anti-Semitism has almost become it's an acceptable ill in college campuses, and we've seen this for the last year and a half or so, where people are allowed to protest. Well, since October 7th, really, and they're allowed to protest against Israel, and they're allowed to keep Israeli students or Jewish American students out of campus and make them fear for being at their place of education. And this gets essentially brushed under the carpet or classed as an expression of free speech by people who would not accept the reverse situation.
Well, it's important to also speak about this clearly. I'm a free speech activist.
Of course.
I believe in the importance of free speech. Yet free speech must also come with limitations. What is happening is there's more free speech, and I'm saying that in air quotes, that's allowed when it's targeting Jews when it's masked with terms of anti-Zionist, anti-Israel, and yet targeting Jewish synagogues, targeting Jewish student groups, targeting Jews who try to walk on campus,
How dare
targeting
they?
how dare they
How dare they?
be openly Jewish?
Mm.
So the free speech, when it's very violent and calling for violence and intimidation, is allowed when it's about Jews. But if it was about LGBT people, if it was about Black people, if it was about Muslim people, if it was about indigenous people, if it was about immigrants, it wouldn't be allowed. So why is there this double standard? What we're seeing are campus caliphates. We're seeing these Western campuses that were once hallowed grounds of critical thought that have become these breeding grounds for regressive, not progressive, but regressive ideologies cloaked in the garb of progress. So that's why I call them fauxgressive. They're fakely progressive. The Council for American Islamic Relations, CARE, Students for Justice in Palestine, SJP, the misleading named JVP, Jewish Voices for Peace, which, by the way, is neither. It's neither a Jewish organization nor is it for peace. Other organizations like Not in Our Name, and all of these pro-Palestinian student groups that have actively spread jihadist propaganda across these campuses that we're seeing in the United States, in Canada, in the UK, across Europe. And what we need to focus on is they do this with funding and ideological support from groups that are linked to terrorist organizations. So academic freedom now includes these horrendous calls to globalize the intifada. Professors defend chants of intifada and resistance by any means necessary as protected free speech. Well, what about the Jewish students who are being harassed, physically threatened, silenced in classrooms? It's insane, and they're labeling themselves as anti-Zionist. They're reframing what Zionism is about. So it's important to say Zionism is the movement about the self and community actualization of the Jewish people, making sure that Jews are connected to their history and their indigenous homeland. If you read Jewish texts, the Bible, the Mishnah, the Talmud, the Gemara, if you look at Jewish prayer books, if you read about every Jewish holiday, we always have a connection to a specific land. The Jewish people have been occupied, have been colonized for thousands of years, and we have always prayed about our homeland, understanding that our peoplehood is directly connected to a specific region. So Zionism is a successful decolonization movement. Zionism is a successful indigenous rights movement that was a movement that started during the Roman era when Jews said, someday we will be able to govern ourselves. Well, you know what? We now govern ourselves.
Yeah, I think it's quite fascinating that the use of Zionist has really become it's so pervasive. And you and I talked briefly about different LGBT movements that almost embrace an anti-Zionist agenda within their frameworks. Could you expand on that a little bit for me?
We see LGBT, or as many refer to themselves, LGBTQIA plus organizations creating safe spaces, which is a wonderful concept of a safe space, and creating spaces including events and conferences and gathering community events to empower and nourish the nationalist movements of the MENA region, of the Middle East and North Africa. Now, what they also have done is said that these are Zionist-free zones, which means they're supporting and nourishing and creating a safe space for nationalist movements of people across the Middle East and North Africa other than for Jews. Zionism is a nationalist movement for Jews. There is nothing wrong with nationalism. We should be able to connect to our nations. What does a nation mean? A group of people who are connected with a common characteristic. It's not only being a citizen of the UK or citizen of the United States or citizen of Israel or citizen of Germany. It can also be about being Catholic, being Orthodox Jewish, being Muslim, being a person who loves to ski, right? A nation is a group of people that wants to connect and help themselves. Sorry, I mentioned the skiing. I'm
How
an
do I
avid
get a
skier.
passport to this skiing nation?
Oh, talk to me because it's my favorite sport. So you're in. You're already in.
Okay.
I mean, I already like you.
I can get a visa. I can
You
get
get
a
a
visa.
visa. Yeah, it's great.
All right. It's just the tariffs that I'm worried about.
That's true. So we've seen these LGBTQ organizations creating spaces for Arab, African, Muslim, LGBT people, but not for Jews. That is racism. Anti-Zionism is racism. Anti-Zionism is hateful bigotry. It's against the Jewish people. So in meetings that I had with the FBI and ADL and all of these major organizations in the United States, part of what I do within my social and political advocacy is making sure that language is used correctly. When the FBI came out with statistics saying that the Jews are the most targeted religious group in the United States, I raised my hand and said, well, wait a second. I've been physically assaulted. I've been targeted because I'm Jewish. I don't walk around with a kippah, a head covering. I don't walk around with side locks, of long hair by my ears. I don't have a beard. I shave. So when I'm targeted, am I being targeted because I'm Jewish as a religion? Or am I being targeted because I'm Jewish as my ethnicity, as my nationality? And they were aware of this, and they were getting a lot more information coming in, and the FBI continued to do even more studies and looking at all the data that they had gathered. And it turns out that the Jewish people in the United States are also the most targeted ethnic group in hate crimes, in ethnic-based hate crimes. We're 2% of the US population, and we're 70% of the victims of religious and ethnic-based hate crimes. That's a pretty terrible statistic.
It's a mind-blowing statistic. Yuval David, we've just about run out of time on this. Could you let our listeners and viewers know where they can follow your work?
Well, I would love for your listeners and viewers to follow my work because I definitely get targeted by hate groups. So help me shift the algorithm to just spread fact-based information instead of
Have you met the internet?
Yeah, I know. But you know what? We are the algorithm. For
Right.
all of your listeners, they should engage with your show. They should share your show. They should comment on your posts and, do the same with me. So it's easy to find me. There aren't that many Yuval Davids, Yuvaldavid on all social media. Although on Instagram, it's Yuval_David_. I couldn't get the Yuval David. So follow me on every platform, and I'd be glad to engage with you on social media.
Yuval, thanks ever so much for being here.
Thank you, Mark.
And that's about all we have time for on this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network from our flagship station in the nation's capital, WWRC in Washington, D.C. I've been your host, Mark Angelides. And I'd like to take a moment to thank our special guests for the day, Mr. Tim Donner, the longtime host of this here show, and Yuval David, activist, author, and filmmaker. Thank you both for being here. You are appreciated. And of course, I'd like to extend my gratitude to you, the listeners out there in Radioland, who take the time each week to tune in and join the show. Final thought for this week. Winston Churchill once said, quote, "All the greatest things are simple, and many can be expressed in a single word: freedom, justice, honor, duty, mercy, hope." End quote. A range of beautiful concepts expressed in single words. And he's right, because the plainest truths do not need to be explained or expanded upon. They just are. When people obfuscate language to usurp the meaning, they know that they're treading on the edge of a dishonest abyss. So let's speak plain. Let's all speak truth. And who knows what kind of world we can create from that. Thanks for listening. And please remember, Liberty Nation does not endorse candidates, campaigns, or legislation. And this presentation is no endorsement. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.